Good morning or afternoon, depending where you are in Europe, and welcome to our session on the consequences of digitalization to gender equality. My name is Christian Veske, and I will be moderating this session here in Tallinn, Estonia. Meeting you all virtually today, it doesn't come as a surprise that all of our lives are being shaped by digital means. The way we work, the way we play, the way we socialize. And at times it brings us joy, but also at times it can lead to frustration. But what are the broader consequences of this process, the process of digitalization? How does it change the social fabric and the ways in which our societies are organized? And namely, what are the consequences to gender equality? This is what we will be discussing here in the panel. And to set the context for this discussion, I'm very proud to introduce you to my colleague, Blandine Mollard, joining us from EIGE in Vilnius. Good morning, Blandine. How are you?
Good morning, Christian. Hello, everyone. I'm very good, thank you.
Before I will give the floor for your presentation, I would also like to remind all the registered participants that you have the possibility to ask questions in the Q&A tab. You also have the possibility to upvote the posts and bring attention to the most pressing of these questions. From these, I will be selecting later on the questions to address the panel. Blandine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I fully agree with you that digital technologies are now everywhere around us. And as someone who is sitting in our meeting room turned Livestream studio, changing slides from my phone, I can tell you I'm feeling this rather literally. Over the past few years, the effect and the presence of digital technologies in our lives have become more and more visible. But what's in it exactly for gender equality? We know from past experience that technological trends are never without gender impact, whether we see them or not. In the Gender Equality Index report this year, we have analyzed digitalization in the context of work. Who develops digital technology? What is the gender makeup of this workforce? What are the opportunities for greater equality in work, in pay, and in terms of work-life balance? So today, I would like to discuss three main trends, either promising or rather alarming, in terms of how digital technologies are affecting gender equality. So starting with the promising, we would like to discuss the ways by which digital technology can be used in the world of care and provide concrete support to caregivers. Then I'll be moving to artificial intelligence, algorithms in particular, and some of the concerns that they raise from a gender equality perspective. Lastly, I want to focus on gender-based violence and how it's enabled by technology in a more and more concerning way, and how it manifests in the context of work. First of all, I want to talk about a topic that is often considered to be central in any progress on gender equality. And this topic is care provision. Who provides care? Who receives care? How care is compensated? All very key questions to understand what are the bottlenecks to gender equality at the moment. And to give you an example, the domain of time in the Gender Equality Index is always the one who is the most impervious to progress, because it touches upon gender norms and gender roles. So in a context where the population in Europe is aging very rapidly, the needs for long-term care services have been increasing also very fast. And in many, many EU member states, long-term care services, which are services who are needed for people with long-term health limitations or disabilities and other chronic conditions, those services are notoriously underdeveloped. To give you an idea, in 2018, the European Commission has estimated that only 35% of people who need long-term care services actually receive access to these services. So this means that the majority of care services in the EU are provided in a very informal fashion. This means by regular people caring for their friends or their family or their spouse, mostly for free. And most of them are women. 62% of informal carers are women. Because of services being underdeveloped, the caregiving burdens on informal carers can be extremely intense. And it can mean that for individuals involved, they have to forego their professional activity to focus on caregiving full-time. So this raises some very serious concern about well-being and economic independence. So in this rather grim context, how can digital technologies be of any help in the context of care? Well, there is a very wide range of assistive technologies that can really concretely support autonomous living for people who need care. There are some very general services that anyone can use that can be of particular use for people needing care, such as Alexa or Siri, that we all use regularly. But there are also some specific apps or services that can prove extremely useful in maintaining autonomous living. Assistive technologies can also support caregivers, for example, in coordinating the services that they need to care for people, simplifying admin tasks, for example, but also supporting them in their actual caregiving tasks by monitoring the health status of people they care for, which has proved very useful, for example, in case of Alzheimer's disease patients. In general, those technologies are proving extremely promising in terms of improving the quality of life for carers and care recipients. And in the context of the pandemic, we can see that tech-based solutions have been widely used already. So there is really a lot of potential in further development. Unfortunately, despite the fact that many caregivers and care recipients are women, there is very often a lack of gender-sensitive approach to the development of those tools. Now I would like to move to the topic of artificial intelligence algorithms. So by artificial intelligence, I'm referring to the systems that display intelligent behavior. So they analyze their environment and they take some action with some degree of autonomy. And in the past few years, those systems have really made their way into an incredible number of products and services that we use regularly. And they really include some very promising aspects. For example, automating some tasks who are extremely prone to human biases can be very promising because there is potential to reduce and mitigate those human biases. Let's take recruitment, for example. If you can delegate this to an intelligent system who would make sure to focus only on skills of the candidates and to discard all the biases that humans can have in terms of ethnicity, gender, or age, or any of the grounds that we see typically claimed for discrimination. This could be very powerful for gender equality and gender equal outcomes in the world of work. But unfortunately, the way algorithms are being developed at the moment raises a lot of concerns from a human rights and gender equality perspective. First of all, because there is a very strong lack of diversity in that sector, ICT is a very gender segregated sector. And it is estimated that only 22% of artificial intelligence professionals are women. So there is a big risk that without diversity in the composition of teams who design algorithms, the human biases will be embedded in the products. The second very strong concern is related to the black box nature of algorithms. It means that it's very, very difficult to understand the mechanisms of creation of an algorithm, even for people who develop them. So that makes evaluation of biases very complicated. And the last concern is the one that is very often talked about these days, is the quality of data that goes into building such algorithms. There is the principle of garbage in, garbage out, meaning that if you use questionable data or data that is full of biases, then your outcome, your final product, will reflect those biases and those concerns. And in the example that I took at the beginning relating to recruitment is really illustrative of this concern with data, because a lot of companies who have been using artificial intelligence in recruitment have been relying on data that has shown really existing biases. So this is a situation where we could see that the potential to mitigate the biases is not really realized. What we see is that it could actually aggravate discrimination against certain marginalized groups because of those three very strong concerns that I just mentioned. Now I would like to move on to the third topic I wanted to raise today. And it's the fact that it's for me one of the most concerning use of digital technologies today, using them to abuse and to harass. So many aspects of our work lives, you mentioned it, Christian, so many of them have turned digital recently. But unfortunately, sexual harassment is also one of them. Because maintaining a very strong online presence is more and more of a requirement in many careers, we can see that it has become extremely common for professional women and professionals with marginalized identities to be targeted by attacks online or on social media. And we see this extremely with a lot of, it's becoming very common in many professions in the public eye, including journalism, politics, activism, academia, and sport. To give you an example from the political arena, 58% of women parliamentarians in Europe and parliamentarian staff have experienced sexist attacks on social media. Abuse often comes from men, whether they are professional peers from the same sector or complete strangers. And it's very concerning to see that attacks are turning collective and they are orchestrated through forums or Facebook groups and can manifest in thousands and thousands of messages in a very short time. The effects on individuals who are targeted by such attacks are extremely profound. But unfortunately, the effects go even broader than just the individuals affected. What we see is that the silencing effect of witnessing attacks online can be very powerful. Eiger has worked on youth and digitalization and has shown that 51% of young women who have either experienced or witnessed hate online then will self-censor their behavior online, will really strongly hesitate before engaging in debates. So we see this as a very concerning trend that undermines the professional reputation of women in many, many fields, but also their legitimacy to engaging in public affairs. This could really have very detrimental effects on some of the gains that we have obtained on women's access to decision-making. It could roll back some of those gains and push women to really forego engaging in public affairs because of the fear for hatred and attacks. Lastly, I would like to discuss one aspect of one ways in which digitalization has affected the world of work in a very visible manner. It's the topic of platform work. And my colleague Jakob is now discussing this topic in a parallel session that I hope you will watch later. So platform work has really shifted the sort of power dynamics that is traditionally between an employer and an employee, and has transformed it into power dynamics between user and platform worker. all this mediated by the platform. And it's true that female platform workers tend to be less visible than their male counterparts. You don't see a lot of women cycling in the city carrying deliveries for food. That's because they often work in gender segregated fields, such as translation or editing or domestic work or childcare. But it doesn't mean that their presence and that they're facing some very gender-based risks. One of them is information asymmetry. It's really the design of the platform is creating this asymmetry of information between the worker and the user, because platforms really strongly encourage and reward workers who post and display a lot of private information on their profiles, including their picture, their name, their place of residence, their age. But unfortunately, they don't have access to a lot of information themselves about the job or the client. So it means they are very often unable to assess the level of safety that there would be in accessing a particular job. For example, platform workers do not have access to any information about the clients. If other workers have raised concerns about risky or disrespectful behavior, the platform worker will not see it. The second aspect is that the most basic information is available to the worker sometimes only after they have accepted the work. And platform workers are also very strongly penalized if they refuse tasks. They can even be excluded from the platform if they refuse too often. So all those very subtle ways in which platforms really make it difficult for workers to assert their own safety and ensure their own safety is a very strong concern. The second one is that very often on platform work, the level of pay and the level of access to work depends on your having good ratings from customers. But unfortunately, those ratings are very often gender-based, gender-biased. So it means that it also is a concern in terms of women having to be very careful in how they behave with clients to avoid negative ratings. Finally, we see that women platform workers often work in very close proximity with clients in their homes or taking care of their house or their children. So this is in itself can place them at risk. So to conclude, I would like to mention that that digital technologies really provide a very vast potential, especially in the world of care, to support caregivers and care recipients. This is really at the beginning of the development of those technologies for many aspects. And in the context in which we are in, this is really promising. But unfortunately, more broadly, there are some effects on gender equalities from digital technologies that are really multiple and concerning. Some aspects, some ways to mitigate those concerns could be to really have very gender-sensitive development approaches across the board, especially in terms of artificial intelligence development. We also need some greater oversight of biases and discrimination in the context of platform work, but also artificial intelligence. And finally, we need some greater regulation and prevention of violence online. At the moment, a lot of law enforcement services are helpless to address and prevent those forms of violence. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and would you have any question? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Blandine. Thank you, Blandine, for this thought-provoking insight on how digitalization really has far-reaching consequences to all aspects of our lives. And now I am really excited to bring in our next guests who are participating in the panel. The first person that we will have here will be joining us from the Netherlands. Sumia, she is working in the Dutch Ministry of Education, Science and Culture. Hello, Sumia. How are you this morning?
Hello, I'm good. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Thank you. It's a nice day here in Tallinn, and it's really interesting conference, and to see it also from this side. But now moving on, we have also Brussels in line, and we have Asha Allen joining us from the European Women's Lobby in Brussels. Hello, Asha.
Good morning. Good morning, Christian. Good morning to everyone. How are we all?
It's all great here. How is Brussels?
It's quite cold, but we are moving forward.
And finally, we have here with us from Vienna, from the Fundamental Rights Agency, Joanna Goody. Hello, Joanna. How are you?
Hi, Christian. Good to hear you and good to see you.
Hi. And of course, we have also Blandine, who is joining our panel discussion. And let's really get down to business. Blandine, in her presentation, pointed out 3 broad trends in digital transformation, which may have significant consequences for gender equality. What are your immediate thoughts on these trends? Have these trends presented themselves in your own work? And I would start with Joanna here.
Okay, thanks, Christian. I read Iger's report, and in particular the focus chapter, with great interest on digitalisation, the future of work. To me, when I was reading it, I just picked up on a couple of points here. I mean, one figure that was given, that was 20% of graduates in ICT-related fields are women, so 1 in 5. And of course, this is just one figure, but that figure really impacts on gender bias, of course, and other forms of bias. Because if we're talking about starting at the point with those who design and develop AI systems, and I'll focus my intervention on AI systems because that's the area that FRA is currently working on. If those developing and deploying AI systems do not reflect the users in terms of gender representativity, this, of course, is an obvious issue. But the same happens, of course, in non-digital worlds too. If you don't have representativity, we think of anything from transport to furniture design in that regard. If you ask me to reflect on FRA's own work, we've got a report coming out in December this year, and we interviewed over 90 developers and deployers of AI systems, both in the public and the private sector. And when we are asking them about their knowledge and understanding of fundamental rights, what was clear is in relation to discrimination and equality, that there's a theoretical understanding, but a very strong absence of a practical understanding of what this means in reality. So this is a key issue here in the understanding of the developers and deployers themselves. And this very much reflects the issue of non-representativity and gender bias. Just maybe if I have time, 1 or 2 other points, but Christian, let me know if you want the others to intervene.
Yep.
Another point, when I was reading the report, it talks under the general heading of consequences of digitalisation about equal rights. And I think, of course, this is key if we're talking about equal rights, because there's the well-worn phrase that rights apply equally offline and online. So as far as FRA's work is concerned, it's the need to ensure that those rights do apply equally online as they should offline. So to challenge gender bias, or rather gender inequality, through the use of algorithms which underpin AI systems, we need to have the oversight and really the transparency with regard to the data and its uses to which it is put. And we need to interrogate whether existing law and the much anticipated new AI law will actually address fully the needs to look at gender bias and other discrimination regarding algorithms. I'll stop here.
Yeah,
Thanks.
John, I will come back to these policy topics a little bit later as well in our discussion. But moving now to Asha. So what were your immediate reactions reading these reports and seeing these trends?
Thank you, Christian. So yes, I'm very much in agreement there with Joanna in regards to the findings of the report, particularly in regards to the broad different experiences that were analysed in this specific chapter. So we do thank the European Institute for Gender Equality of focusing on this in this particular index. But what was quite clear for us is that a lot of this data that has been collected has been known for some time, and there is need for some more comprehensive data in regards to the gender biases that exist, but also in regards to the representation and participation of women in the different spaces. So what we think is that this is actually a very solid basis for which to work from, and the index provides a very good basis for us to continue to research and look into these specific issues and find out more, both qualitative and quantitative data, in order for us to build on recommendations and have concrete actions at European level and member state level to increase women's representation in this space, to improve their experiences in the digital space, and to really ensure that what we understand is that the digital space and the offline space are now not two separate spaces. Our world is very much blurred in between the two, and so this needs to be brought forward into the policy making that we have.
Thank you, Asha. And Soumya, the same question to you. You read the report and heard now the presentation, and we'll get to a little bit later to what exactly incredible initiative that you are developing or preparing in the Netherlands. But what were your immediate reaction to what you just heard?
Well, I can only echo what Joanna and Asha just mentioned with regards to the segregation in certain sectors, especially when it comes to ICT sectors, as Blondine also mentioned and highlighted during her presentation. And something that we also came across while talking to different parties in the field ahead of our preparing our work for the organization of a hackathon, which is set to take place this weekend. And I will elaborate a little bit more on the hackathon later on. But these are all remarks and also numbers that we see reflected in those conversations and in those conversations that we held with different parties in the field. So we're talking about HR and diversity officers. We're talking about people working in ICT, and also very keen to bring about change in the ways that AI is being employed, especially in the field of recruitment and hiring processes.
Thank you. And I would come back now to Asha. In her presentation, Blandine mentioned as gender-based violence in the digital world as one of the core topics. And for the European Women's Lobby, violence against women is also one of the core topics that you work with. We have seen and heard really many incidences of violence against women where the digital means are used. In your opinion, how should Europe go forward to avoid a scenario where digitally enabled violence against women is commonplace? How this should be addressed?
Yes, you're very right, Christian, in regards to the reality for women in the online space at this moment in time. The European Women's Lobby, as you mentioned, have been working on violence against women for the last 30 years or so, and we count on the expertise of our observatory experts to be able to tell us what's going on the ground. And they were one of the first, actually, to inform us 4, 5, 6 years ago about the prevalence of online violence against women and girls. What I would emphasize here is that it's crucial to understand that digitally facilitated violence and specific forms of violence that happen in the online space is unfortunately already commonplace in the world of work, as the index has highlighted, but far beyond this as well. Very grateful to Blandine for mentioning some of the information there on regards to the data. But what we see is that 9 million girls in Europe are now experiencing violence online before the age of 15, and that this information is increasing and that experience is increasing for many women. And we need to have a very kind of holistic perspective and understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about violence against women in the online space. Our colleagues mentioned earlier today about the experience of women during the COVID-19 crisis, the height of the crisis. And it's very important to note that service providers who are providing services for potential victims of intimate partner violence were highlighting how much online tools were being used in the coercion or in the perpetration of intimate partner violence. So it needs to be understood and recognized that online violence against women or violence facilitated by digital tools is part of the continuum of violence against women that we have been highlighting and raising awareness on for the last 30 years of our existence. So what we would call for at European level, but at member state level, of course, is that this holistic and comprehensive analysis needs to be understood, and this needs to be the approach when it comes to tackling violence against women online, because it needs to be tackled in the context of ending and preventing all forms of violence against women in Europe, simply because, as I mentioned before, the line is so blurred in between the online and the offline space, and much of our lives are in the digital space at this moment in time. So really there needs to be no differentiation there. What we would call for is a comprehensive EU framework that harmonises mechanisms that already exist, such as the Victims' Rights Directive, but of course to go further, and as our colleagues mentioned before, this includes the urgent ratification of the Istanbul Convention by all EU member states and the EU to exceed it as well. And we would also call for a new framework directive, as called for by the European Parliament on several occasions, in which online violence would be recognised within this framework. So there is the opportunity to expressly define violence against women online, but also recognise this digital dimension in the perpetration of violence against women from a broad spectrum. And we would ensure that all stakeholders need to be engaged in this urgently, and really to ensure that what we are seeing with platforms and digital tools is the opportunities that exist for women. We need to make sure that this is a safe space and the tools are safe and devoid of any algorithmic biases, to make sure that women and organizations continue to maximize on the benefits of these tools, because of course it was digital platforms that allowed us to raise awareness for women's rights issues, such as during the Me Too movement. And in increasingly shrinking civil society space, online platforms and tools are so essential when it comes to mobilization. So this is what we really want to see, a comprehensive approach that adopts a holistic and intersectional feminist perspective in its implementation and in its development, and to ensure that the digital transition and the digital tools and the digital mechanisms that we are looking to advance are beneficial to all women and girls in Europe.
Thank you, Asha. And indeed, violence against women in the digital world is something that many of us have witnessed, also seen the incidents of these things happening. But there is something that is quite often even less visible. That's the systematic discrimination and gender bias that could happen in the when developing the algorithms. So now I would go to Sumia, and I would like to, Sumia, I have you back here on the screen, and the Netherlands has been leading or is developing, working on an exciting initiative to develop an algorithm to identify gender biases in AI. Can you shed a little bit light what's coming up? What have you found, or what have been the challenges in this work?
Thank you so much for this question. Well, let me first correct you a little bit. We're not currently at this moment already have developed an algorithm that is bias-free. But we're in the middle of organizing a hackathon, normally an event that brings parties together in order to come up with a solution to together from different disciplines also approach and tackle this issue of existing biases in the use of automated processes in recruitment and hiring. processes. So just let me take you back a little bit to the context here in the Netherlands, and also what was for us a little bit of a starting point for the legislation that is also currently being drafted. When we look at, for instance, two examples of big multinationals that in the recent years have been using AI and algorithms in order to recruit and select candidates. We see with one multinational, for instance, not so long ago, that in developing and creating a new tool that was set out to recruit new talent, the system, although believed to be objective, neutral, and assign also objective scores to the candidates that were recruited, was actually perpetuating the data, the input that was inserted, namely that in that organization there were more men working as employees than women. So the system automatically also learned and it taught itself that it had to favor men and deem women unsuitable. And there's another example of another multinational that in the recent years, they were trying to really diversify their management staff, and they were seeing that there were not enough women in their management staff. And by the use of recruitment technologies, such as automated processes and strategies that are akin to AI, they found that in the recent year or so, they could actually diversify their management staff and really bring into at the very least a half of 50% of gender parity. So there's what these two examples actually displays that as well as there are risks and challenges, there are also very much potential to contribute to gender equality. And this is the aim of the hackathon. It's also during this weekend to bring parties from different fields. As it was mentioned, ICT is mainly gender segregated and in favor of men. But there are also other fields like just diversity and inclusion that is just, it mirrors the other way around. To bring all these different parties together, and as said in the presentation by Blondine, also diversify the teams going about recruitment and hiring processes. And we're trying to emulate that by having teams consisting of different parties, such as ICT people, but also lawmakers, lawyers, and gender experts, to together think about what the ultimate solution could be in reducing and uncovering bias in the data that we insert into these processes. So as said before, this hackathon will take place this weekend, and we are very happy afterwards to also present the outcomes of the hackathon during the mutual learning program on gender equality on the 12th and 13th of November, where we will be presenting the outcomes and also our lessons learned so far, and hopefully reinforce also the legislation that is currently being drafted in the Netherlands that will ensure that employers can ascertain that they have not disfavored candidates in the use of such algorithms while recruiting and selecting.
Sumi, this is really, really interesting, and we're really looking forward to the outcomes of this hackathon and really to get more information what happened and how this hackathon went. But now, going to Joanna, it leads this what was just said here earlier, and also by Asha. It leads to the question how to address really these issues through policy. We know that the large enterprises in Europe, there is a high number of these enterprises that use big data for their decision making. How do we really ensure that usage of this data and creating the algorithms are fair to women and men?
Well, thanks, Christian. I think as a starting point, we need to recognise that, of course, both the public and the private sector are increasingly using or wanting to use large-scale data, big data for AI. And I'm speaking about AI here. And it's about the governance of who's developing, deploying, selling these systems to people. So that, to me, is a point that I'll come back to. And you asked about how do we ensure fairness, but again, I would reiterate the point that we need to ensure equality and non-discrimination before the law, so to ensure people's rights. Now, if we're talking about ensuring equality and non-discrimination before the law, in the Fundamental Rights Agency, we've produced work looking at the use of big data and bias in data-supported decision-making. And there are basic points that we've outlined that are now being stated again and again in different forums and fora, which I can reflect upon. So if you're talking about ensuring equality in AI systems and going back to basics with the algorithms that are used, you need to have transparency. We also talk about the need for, in the long term, a fundamental rights impact assessment that's holistic. You need to reflect on the quality of the data, and you need a meaningful explanation with regards to what goes into an algorithm, which sometimes people say is an impossible challenge, but there is evidence to the contrary too, explicability. So all of these need to be framed under legal certainty, because if you have legal certainty, then it affords people that they can actually know their rights, and when things go wrong, when they are discriminated against, they can hopefully enforce them in practice, although that's another big debate. So if we go back to what's happening in these discussions at the level of the EU, and I'll only refer to the EU here, over the last 2 years or so over more than 2 years now, there's been widespread discussion at the level of the European Commission, the Parliament, the Council, the Member States, civil society and academia. So a couple of examples of what's going on and what we're leading to. You have the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, which DG Connect convened. FRA was a member of that. And that produced ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. And in those ethics guidelines was an assessment list. And that referred to non-discrimination, the need to drill down, to look into the data, the users, those making the choices about the kind of data that's used. So that's something that really a lot of people have been talking about. And these ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI have been referred to. They refer to non-discrimination. The European Parliament produced a report, which they brought out just in October. So it outlines a framework for ethical aspects of AI. And it's towards the proposal for a new regulation. You had the Commission white paper on AI. And of course, that refers to fundamental rights. It encompasses non-discrimination. Of course, now you have the hotly anticipated new EU law on AI, so a regulatory framework for the EU. You have other areas of law like the Digital Services Act, which really are addressing AI. You have multiple ethics guidelines and principles being produced by many, many actors. It's an incredibly busy field. But to go back to your question about fairness, or rather equality, when we're talking about AI and data, whilst there are many parallel discussions, what we're seeing in the EU now is working towards, of course, this regulatory framework. And a lot of discussion about the need to harmonise the law within the EU to have legal certainty. And that's where we're going. And we have to see what shape and form the actual law will have, because it covers areas like risk, high-risk areas, and does that then negate coverage for seemingly benign areas, which actually might have risks for gender equality? A few years ago, you were still hearing from the tech business that we simply need self-regulation. You can't constrain digitalization. It will not lead to the EU being in the forefront of tech advances. But we can see that self-regulation works up to a point, but then it doesn't work. We see that with online content moderation as an example there, which impacts, of course, on violence against women. And finally, I'll just make the point to to ensure fairness or equality before the law in terms of AI, you also need to, of course, create a supervisory authority. And there's a lot of discussion about what that could mean. And it's something that FRA will also comment on when it publishes a report on this in December. But I think one key aspect of that, if you're talking about supervisory authority, and different models are out there like data protection authorities, not only do these authorities need to have the technical expertise, but you need to have an understanding of equality and non-discrimination hardwired into all aspects of the work. So other panelists have spoken about the need to ensure representativity, diversity, so the right knowledge base and the right skill set to really say, through a supervisory authority, when we talk about the application of AI systems in practice, how do we ensure that they're not discriminating from the conceptualization of the system through to its deployment and through to checking it? And within that, of course, like I said, the discussions about what is a high-risk AI area and a low-risk AI area might negate the issues to do with gender bias, equality and non-discrimination in seemingly benign AI systems, particularly when they use proxy data, which might seem quite innocent, but can have significant consequences, not only with respect to gender, but of course, with respect to age, ethnicity, disability, you name it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this, John. And indeed, these discussions and developments that are right now happening, they are very interesting to follow. And of course, ever more so, it's important that the right decisions, taking the equality and gender equality, gender perspectives also into account at the right time. But going back now to Blandine, to Vilnius, we heard here from the policy frameworks, we heard the different angles to digitalization, but what we really didn't focus yet too much on who is behind of developing these AI algorithms. Who does that? How does this happen?
Yes, unfortunately, this is a very, very key question. And this is something we couldn't focus on too much in the conference, but I really encourage you to read the chapter in the report dedicated to the workforce of who is behind gender digital technology development. And as Joanna mentioned, we looked really from the input side to actually the output. So looking from students to actual ITC specialists, AI professionals. So you can see that it's a very gender segregated field from students to the output. So and it's not evolving really rapidly at all. We have also done some work on women in ITC, and it can be quite demoralizing actually, because even though there are a lot of high-level policy effort to try to improve the share of women in science, in engineering, in STEM, and in ICT, we feel that we see that actually those efforts are somewhat unsuccessful. We've done some really in-depth analysis with the careers of women in ICT, and we find that there is a very sizable portion of ICT professionals, women ICT professionals, who actually leave the field to come back to traditionally female occupations, including teaching. So yes, they will teach ICT, but they do not contribute anymore to developing technologies and to producing knowledge in that field. Yeah. So this is a concerning development, because it really shows that there are some really pervasive gender equality concerns in terms of attitudes, in terms of work practices in the field that are detrimental to greater diversity. As I said in my presentation, when it comes to AI specifically, there are different percentages floating around, but what we see globally is that only 22% of AI professionals are women. So, And this is not, and we like a certain intersectional analysis and perspective to understanding also who are those women who work in AI and how long are they staying in the field, what kind of position do they have in that field, and this is really something that is of concern because, as we said, the lack of diversity in who develops those algorithms and those algorithmic products is then potentially leading to biases being unchecked, going unchecked, and being perpetrated down the line to the products and to the final services that we use.
Yeah, thank you very much, Blandine. And now we have been focusing on quite challenging side of digitalization, I would say, but it also can ease people's lives. And we have now Claire Champet from Eurocarers joining us to give us a short intervention on how digitalization is shaping informal care. Hello, Claire.
Good morning.
How are you?
Can you hear me? I'm very well, thank you. I would like first to very warmly thank the Institute for giving us a floor today and more generally for engaging in dialogue with Eurocarers in the last few years. We are a European network representing informal carers and their organization, currently bringing together 73 carers and research organizations from 26 countries. When we speak about informal carers, we refer to a person who provides usually unpaid care to someone with a chronic illness, disability, or any other long-lasting health or care needs outside of a professional or formal network. So, as Blandine mentioned, family members, friends, and neighbors. IG focus on the gender dimension of care is particularly relevant since we know that the way long-term care is organized contribute to the unbalanced distribution of care responsibilities between men and women. And besides, women not only provide more informal long-term care, they also provide more intense care than men. This is important to know. Last year, we found it very useful the way IG shed light on the correlation between the informal care gap and the gender pay and pension gaps. What we can see from the initial data collected via our network now shows that the COVID crisis is putting more and more pressure on informal carers and therefore on women mainly. The question is therefore, how can digitalization help? I will try to provide some answers which are based on our members' work in a range of projects which are exploring the potential offered by ICT-based solutions for carers. Because now there's clear and ample evidence that ICT-based solution can be key assets to address informal carers' needs. And as mentioned already by Blandine very rightly, this online solution can help carers in their caring tasks, notably through facilitating the coordination of care between carers, domestic care workers, health and social care professionals. But they can be also extremely instrumental in addressing carers' own needs, notably in breaking the isolation that they very often suffer from. Notably, ICT-based solution can help carers with accessing information, training, skills validation programs, as well as, importantly, platform for peer support. All of this can not only improve the quality of the care they provide, but also their own self-confidence, their quality of life, and their ability to be included in society, to participate, to gain competence and skills and be more active, possibly on the labor market. It is very positive to see supporting tool emerging since the outbreak of the pandemic. And today, ICT-based support for carers is a fast-evolving domain with a multiplicity of innovative solutions addressing the various practical aspects of the carer's situation. However, the availability of these tools remain fragmented and their sustainability is often at stake. Furthermore, for them to adequately support informal carers, there are a series of policy challenges that need to be overcome. Notably, we need to develop the capacity of such tool to bridge the gap between informal and professional carers in a frame of a fair sharing of task and responsibility, really to build a partnership in care underpinning the use of such tools. We have a limited also number of solutions which are targeted at carers and co-design with them, really to address their own needs that they only know. We can see also an important lack of digital skills and inequalities in access to ICT infrastructure and devices, especially in certain regions and in certain parts of the population. We see a lack of digital health literacy, which is quite important also, and the need to secure a safe environment in ICT to build trust around these tools. As rightly underlined in the IG reports this year, today countries aim to promote independent living together with a greater use of ad hoc technological solutions in order to meet the growing demand in long-term care. But the truth is that if we want to ensure universal access to affordable and quality long-term care, while at the same time supporting informal carers sufficiently, this requires to connect the dot between different governance levels, policy areas and sector activities. It also calls for resolute investment in both formal and informal care. In such a context, which is quite complex, ICT-based solutions for care should not be approached as a quick fix to contain the costs, but as one and only one tool in a toolbox, along with the face-to-face delivery of services in the framework of a very comprehensive approach to long-term care. And on this point, we very much expect the European Commission to take ambitious initiative and show the way and foster progress on the Principle 18 of the social pillar, which is about allowing access to long-term care to all, via clear common objectives, comparable indicators, research, mutual learning, and showing political win in this area, which is crucial to gender equality also. And this is to be done in combination with many other principles of the pillar, notably on the work-life balance of carers, gender equality, active support to employment, and minimum income, pension right, etc., which all should take into account the situation and the particular needs of people who provide care to somebody among their relatives for free. And only by taking this perspective into consideration, we will progress in the gender equality index. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this insight on the informal care and care in general, how it relates to digitalization. And of course, you were really right in saying that that this sector and these informal carers have been very much impacted by the last 7-8 months since the beginning of the pandemic. But I know that there are viewers now with really burning questions for the panelists. So I would go back to the panelists and I will take some questions from our Worksup platform and bring these to you. If any of you feel that this is a right question also for them, please let me know as well. First, I would like to ask, how can we promote the cooperation between tech companies and governments to build a fairer society? And I would actually maybe ask this question from Sumia, because this is something I think you have done in the Netherlands to some extent, or within in this framework of hackathon. It's definitely should have been a question that have been on the table.
Yes. It's a very interesting question, and it's a question that we're also trying to figure out as we're organizing this hackathon, and also looking forward to the outcomes that it will deliver. I think that it is very important, as one of the aims of the hackathon is to raise awareness of the presence of bias in such automated processes. So not only involve those that are the usual suspects. We already talked about ICT people. We talked about potentially technological companies, as well as organizations such as multinationals, just as mentioned, or other employers that have been using increasingly AI in order to recruit and select their candidates. I think that what is very important is to create a platform of dialogue in which all the stakeholders feel compelled to come together and talk with one another about the issues that they respectively also encounter in their respective fields. And one of the things that the hackathon aims to do to that effect is indeed bring at the very least 2 or 3 important stakeholders, so governments. We are as the Ministry of Culture, Science, Culture, and we are here also involved with the representatives of internal affairs, as well as the representatives of social affairs, engaging in that conversation, in that dialogue with tech companies, but as well as HR people connected to tech companies, as well as organizations using such algorithms.
Thank you, Joanna. Maybe you have a little bit also additional insight to that question, because you mentioned earlier that you've been involved in the group at the European Commission dealing with AI, and you're very much involved in the sort of this work. So at the EU level, maybe you have some good examples that you've seen or heard in your work as well.
Thank you, Christian. I think we also have to be very careful, because there's a lot of very high-level engagement by tech companies with government. So whilst the question, if I heard it correctly, is how can we promote cooperation between tech companies and government, I think we also have to be aware that governments and the private sector are bombarded by companies trying to sell them apps, AI systems. And what we see with government, perhaps, and also certain private companies, where they don't have the technical know-how, they don't perhaps quite grasp what it is that they're being encouraged to use, and all the implications for that, particularly from when we talk about gender equality, non-discrimination, and all the fundamental rights issues that go hand in hand, data protection, for example, being one of them. So it's kind of a word of caution, I would say. We encourage cooperation, but when government is responding to a lot of these ideas that are being proposed, that they really, not only do they need lawyers, not only do they need experts in relation to equality, but they really need the technical experts to ask the right questions about the product. So that's one thing that comes to mind when I heard that particular question. Like I said a bit earlier, it was the case that originally, when the high-level expert group on AI was established, a lot of companies were saying, we don't need regulation. You need to let companies explore, develop. They need these sandboxes, as they refer to it in the industry, to test things. That is all acknowledged, but you need the proper oversight, and that will come ultimately from government in this regard. So I think we need to be a little bit cautious when we think about cooperation, whilst also acknowledging the huge benefits that AI can bring when it's correctly applied.
Thank you for this. And now moving to Asha, we have a question regarding how can we design transformative gender policies that encourage both women's participation in tech jobs and men's participation in care jobs? So from the civil society perspective, you obviously connected also to sort of these topics of what could be your idea how these policies could be designed?
Yes, so I think this actually ties into slightly with the previous question in ensuring that civil society are engaged as part of these policy-making processes. This is why it's so important that all stakeholders are engaged throughout the process. And it's quite important in relation to how policy-making is done to take into consideration the expertise that women's civil society can bring to these discussions, but also that this comprehensive analysis is maintained and that there are almost checks and balances in regards to how it's done so that no voice is excluded from the process. And I think in relation to the previous question as well, where this ties in, is this perspective that there needs to be cooperation simply between governments and tech companies in regards to how these policies are developed. And I think what we need to recognize there is that without the voices of civil society, we have already seen where mistakes have been made without those perspectives and without that expertise as part of those conversations. And it also brings into the question of other elements of the index. If we recognize that our political decision-making spaces are not diverse and that the tech company spaces are not diverse, then these should not be the two only actors involved in this policy-making process. And it needs to go beyond policy-making, of course. Policy-making is a vital and crucial step, and so is legislative change, but effective and impactful and visible implementation on the ground is imperative. Without this, then the levels and the measures that we've taken are not going to have a real societal or direct impact for all women and girls in Europe. So we would push to actually ensure that all stakeholders are engaged, that the experts are engaged throughout the process, and it really is about the effective implementation and going even further beyond to see what are the problems that remain and how can policy respond to this in correlation with the actions that need to be taken by community-based services, by civil society actors, and by us as policymakers and those involved in those conversations.
Thank you very much for this. And now I would move to Blandine, to Vilnius. And we have a question from a viewer, and they want to know, is there a way to make cyberspace safer for women activists, especially women of color and women with disabilities? And you have also in the past worked with the Austrian presidency report that we did on the challenges of digitalization for young people. And violence against women and online spaces was one of these topics there that you covered. Was there any good examples, anything that came out from that report or subsequent reports, or anything that you have seen or heard that could be brought to the viewers here today?
Yes, this is a very pervasive forms of violence. And as I said in my presentation, especially women, when they are really disrupting the status quo, when they are breaking barriers to what is expected in terms of women's role, when they are particularly young or when they come from a marginalized identity, they are really especially targeted. So this is something that we see again and again. And this is very demoralizing. Because also in part because I think many countries in Europe are really being humbled by the level of violence that is being experienced by many women online, and feel rather helpless in preventing those forms of violence. And I totally agree with what has been said earlier, especially by Joanna, in terms of the need to go really beyond self-regulation of the platforms. Because when we talk about online violence, especially gender-based, it's really something that is also coming again and again, that self-regulation is a really promising step. But we all acknowledge that this is far from being enough, and it doesn't provide the adequate protection or prevention from violence. So we really need to move to a regulatory framework that would increase that protection. For example, what Asha mentioned, that to have an holistic understanding of how online violence is really just part of the continuum of the different forms of gender-based violence that we see every day, and that online spaces and offline spaces are just one space, and that rights should apply in both spaces. So there is the need for the existing framework to be applied in both spaces, but also to develop a new legal framework that would apply to specific offences that are happening online.
Thank you very much, Blondinas. We are moving towards the end of this session. We still have so many burning questions that people want to ask, but I would come to Asha with the same question very briefly. What would be your suggestion, your ideas related to that?
So I just want to support what Blandy was saying there in regards to having different mechanisms to approach this question. But I think we need to be very, very clear that a gendered approach needs to be taken. Women are 27 times more likely to be harassed and experience violence online, particularly those who are politically engaged, such as activists, such as journalists, and such as politicians. And I think it's very imperative we need to move away from this concept that algorithmic solutions are the way forward, which then ties into this concept of self-regulation, that the platforms themselves can respond to this particular situation. Because what we've seen is this self-regulation and self-content moderation has not only been not enough for women, it's actually been actively harmful in silencing some women and removing them from the space even more so. And so what we also need to recognize is that by saying algorithmic solutions may be the way forward, what we are also then ignoring is the fact that those developing the algorithmic solutions already are not a diverse group of people. So what we need to really look into is a political framework, is a legislative framework, but actively work towards creating this notion of digital citizenship and prioritizing the safety of women and girls in the online space. It needs to be the number one priority, and recognizing that those who are in different intersections of discrimination or politically engaged are much more exposed to this. And of course, women's civil society need to be there to highlight where those key issues may be.
Thank you very much. And I know that Joanna also would like to ask a question from our previous participant, Claire from Eurocarers. Joanna.
Yes, thank you very much, Claire. Really listened to your intervention with great interest. And one thing that's talked about in relation to care is the use of robotics. And a lot of this is quite science fiction, the notion that somehow the care of older persons, persons with disabilities, you name it. A lot of talk about the use of robotics, which is part of AI, of course. And I really think whether any consideration of that area beyond, say, the use of apps, because I think a lot of the issues, again, go down to who are the designers of this kind of technology, and is it really appropriate? Because it raises huge ethical questions.
Okay, Claire, we really have only a few minutes left, so very briefly, I know it's a long answer probably to that question, but try to squeeze it to a minute.
Yeah, I will be very concise. I think a great challenge we have ahead is to ensure the participation of people concerned by care arrangements and care tools and all the robotic that you mentioned. We see it being developed, but very seldom there's a clear co-design approach, so a clear engagement with people who are going to use it. And I don't mean by co-design, I don't mean some testing in the end of the process. I mean including people who will receive care and people who provide care in their daily life, and in partnership with a healthcare professional, being included in the initial thinking that will lead to the development of such robotic. And for that, we see a main weakness, which is a lack of representation of informal carers. In many countries, they are represented in some countries, but if you take Eastern Europe, we see very, very little organization who can voice their concern and who can be partner in this co-design and co-development.
Claire?
So I think you have to break the invisibility of carers and build their participation.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm sure these discussions will go on, and I encourage those discussions go on. And I thank all the panelists for joining us here today. It was really an amazing experience for me. I hope that it was also amazing experience for you. So thank you, Blandine, Soumya, Asha, Joanna, joining us, and Claire as well. And our conference will continue now with the conclusions, so stay tuned.